Well, we will go ahead and dive right into it. I am quite delighted to introduce Darren Parry. He is the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. He serves on the board of directors for the American West Heritage Center in Wellsville, Utah, as well as the Utah State Museum Board, the Community Advisory Board for the Huntsman the Huntsman Cancer Institute, and the Utah Humanities Board and the PBS Utah Board of Directors. Darren attended the University of Utah and Weber State University and received his bachelor's degree in secondary education with an emphasis on history. He is the author of The Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History, and teaches Native American history at Utah State University. Darren's passions in life are his wife, Melody, his 7 children, his 14 grandchildren, and his other passion is his tribal family. He works sure to make sure that those who have gone before him are not forgotten. Darren, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you. And I'm always humbled when I get a call to speak to people, because I feel like I don't have a lot to offer other than a Native American perspective, maybe, and a perspective that I've been taught from the earliest days that I can remember. So it's a blessing for me to be here. It's an honor. And it's a topic that's really dear to my heart. So having said that, one day as I gave a presentation to a group of 4th graders, a young girl asked me when the Shoshone children had time to go to school, since all of their time, it seemed, was spent hunting and gathering. And I told her that the children went to school in the winter. Winter was always the elders' time to tell stories. You see, stories are how we taught values and disseminated knowledge within the tribe. So with that as a backdrop, let me teach you an eternal principle now through story that my people have always lived by. One day, a hunter brought home a sizable kill, far too much to be eaten by his family alone. A mountain man nearby asked him how he was going to store the excess, because drying and storing technologies were available then. The hunter seemed puzzled by the question. He looked at the mountain man and said, "Store the meat? Why would I do that?" Instead, he sent out an invitation for the whole village to gather around his fire. And they did so, and they ate until every last morsel was consumed. Well, this seemed to puzzle the mountain man even further. And he again asked, "Given the uncertainty of fresh meat in the forest, why didn't you just store the excess meat for your family for future use?" Which seemed logical. "Store the meat," the hunter said. "I store the meat in the belly of my brother." You see, Shoshone people lived like their forefathers had lived for thousands of years. We were hunters and gatherers. We traveled with the changing seasons. We referred to ourselves as Niwa, which means the people. We look upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that we call her mother. You see, to us, she is always the provider of our livelihoods. To Native people, the mountains and the streams and the plains stand forever, and seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different areas when the game was plentiful and the seeds and berries were abundant. If you can imagine, it was a hard way of life. We were probably never more than a few days away from starvation, but it was a happy life. Every member of the tribe in those days played an important role in its survival. That family relationship was sacred. This relationship between the people and the land was always sacred, and it was always spiritual. In Native American culture, the parenting role places great importance on letting the children know who they are in relationship to their eternal family, their kin, their people, the environment, and the living spirits of their ancestors, and the land. These relationships help to define a child's identity by how they are connected to everything in the environment. We in the LDS faith have done an adequate job with all of the above things I've mentioned, except the environment. This was the life of my Shoshone people for thousands of years until 1847. Well, I think we all know what happened in 1847. On July 31st in 1847, the Shoshone chief, Sagwitch, who happens to be my third great grandfather, traveled to Salt Lake City to meet with Brigham Young and that first group of pioneers. Now, because of his illness, he did not meet with Brigham Young that day. He instead met with a man named Heber C. Kimball. At the conclusion of that meeting, Heber C. Kimball said this: "You do not own the land. The land belongs to the Lord, and we calculate to plow and plant it." You know what Heber C. Kimball didn't know is that Sagwitch would have agreed with him on that point, on the ownership of the land, in his view. Native American people never viewed the land as something that could be owned by anyone. They believed that the Great Spirit made them stewards over the land, and it was their responsibility to take care for it. But things were about to change. After all, it was the pioneers' manifest destiny to come to this valley and establish their settlements. This delicate balance in which the Shoshone people managed food resources for thousands of years was drastically altered by colonization, which included the Latter-day Saints. In establishing these settlements, they plowed up the grasslands that provided precious seeds that were used as a food source by the Shoshone. They destroyed plants that fed the bison, deer, and the elk, and the other game animals. This lack of understanding between two cultures and the shortage of resources caused conflicts over the land and water and food. As a contemporary Shoshone man said, the Shoshones welcomed the settlers and tried to be hospitable, but really didn't realize what they had in mind. They retaliated when injustices were done to them, when their very survival was threatened, when their traditional way of life was made impossible. What else could they do? My people have always believed that the earth and all of its creations came into being by that Great Spirit as the designer and the creator and father. The Great Spirit put into place finely tuned systems and cycles and physical parameters that would always sustain life. We were given careful instructions to take care of it. Our role was always that of a caretaker and not an owner, a distinction that is not understood by Western values. Those Western values include ownership, extraction, and depletion. But to my native people, the lands have always belonged to the Creator. We have been given careful instruction to not overuse the land and allow it to rest during certain times. The Creator expects us to sustainably manage the resources that we have, including our animal and plant kinfolk. In fact, He does this by way of commandment. After the creation of the world, one of the first commandments given to Adam and Eve, our first parents, was to multiply and replenish the earth, and that they would have dominion or stewardship over this earth. We have been instructed to leave an inheritance for those to come in the future. You know, I think back to the first Europeans that arrived in this country. They must have thought that the fertile, well-managed, maintained land just happened to be. They knew that native people existed, but I don't think they gave them much credit for their skill or knowledge. They seemed to miss the highly complex and sustainable form of earth management that had been practiced for centuries. The lands that the colonizers first put their eyes upon was not untouched or wild, as I have read, but rather the result of a broad range of indigenous land management techniques. In the late 1800s, a man named John Muir said that the Indians walked softly and hurt the landscape hardly more than a bird or a squirrel. And as a result, the land before the Europeans arrived was rich and fertile, organized and well tended. Our people never struggled against nature. They worked within the set bounds and out of a spirit of respect. We took no more than we could use and used all that we could from what we took. Always making sure that we put the time and the energy back into the land so that it would continue to yield for years to come. We have always believed, as you should, that the Great Spirit put everything on this earth for our survival. You see, nature needs to be tended and carefully and lovingly maintained, to be respected and not dominated. The natural resources on this earth will continue to produce year after year only when our steps are light and our hearts are right. But where do we go from here? How do we begin to address cultural and environmental injustices that have taken place for centuries? You know, environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependency of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Environmental justice demands the public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all people, free from any form of discrimination or bias. And how do we make sure that our efforts going forward are truly sustainable and inclusive? How do we answer these questions? And is it ever going to be possible to do things differently? Because heaven knows we need to. The story I shared earlier about the hunter at the beginning of tonight's discussion highlights the problems that we face. But it also holds what I think is the answer to our future that will allow us to move forward in this new direction. You know, Western worldviews value extraction, depletion, and individual self-gain. Oh, and least I forget, individual rights. But indigenous values teach us that we all have obligations. Obligations to the past, obligations to the present, and obligations to the future, and to our communities and our church. These are not only indigenous values, they can't be, but should be Christian values and values shared by any people that want to make a difference in this world. Western world values tend to be scientific and skeptical, often requiring proof for a basis of belief. Indigenous worldviews are based on spiritual-oriented society. This is a system based on a belief in the spirit world. To Native people, land and water are spiritual. Western worldviews teach us that there is only one truth based on science or law. Indigenous worldviews say there can be many truths. Truths are dependent upon individual experiences. Western worldviews has a way of compartmentalizing society. Indigenous worldviews say that societies operate on a state of relatedness. Everything and everyone is related. My grandmother used to tell me that all of the plants and animals are our kinfolk. We're no better than they. We have a belief that people and the objects in the environment are all connected. Law, kinship, spirituality reinforces this connectedness. Identity to us always comes from these individual connections. Western worldviews say that the land and its resources should be available for development and extraction for the benefit of humans. Indigenous worldviews believe that the land is sacred and only is given by our Creator to be carefully and lovingly maintained. Western worldviews judge your success by how much you've achieved and your status in this life. Indigenous worldviews judge success by the quality of your relationships with people. Western worldviews say that human beings are the most important thing in the world. Indigenous worldviews say that human beings are not the most important things in this world. And Western worldviews teach that amassing wealth should always be for personal gain, where my indigenous worldviews say that amassing wealth is important for the good of the whole community. The great Iroquois nation have a beautiful way of governing. Their leadership doesn't make any decisions without considering what effects that decision will have on 7 generations into the future. Think about that. Think about what a different world that we'd all live in today if we all governed that way. You know, the founder of our church, Joseph Smith, was completely aware of how the beauty of this earth testifies of a divine creator, and that we have a divine responsibility to care for the very creations that the Savior made. He said, "I look upon the sun and also the moon, rolling in their majesty through the heavens, and also the stars shining in their courses in the earth, also upon which I stood, and the beasts of the fields, and the fowls of the heavens, and the fish of the waters, and also man walketh forth upon the face of the earth in majesty and in strength and in beauty, whose power and intelligence is governing the things which are so exceedingly great and marvelous. And when I consider upon these things, my heart exclaimed, well hath the wise man said, it is a fool that saith in his heart that there is no God or creator. My heart exclaimed, all of these things bear testimony and bespeak of an omnipotent and omnipresent power, a being who maketh laws and decreeth and bringeth all things within their bounds. End of quote. I believe with all my heart, and I want you to know that I'm a 6th generation Shoshone Latter-day Saint, but I believe with all my heart that our religion and our environment are fundamentally braided together like sweetgrass. When you look at our environment as something that is spiritual in nature, it changes how we treat it. But only then are we allowed to change our paradigm and change the way we look at things. So, what is our stewardship as Latter-day Saints? I think our Creator expects every one of us to act as good stewards of the land that He created. As stewards over this creation, He expects accountability. As Latter-day Saints, most of our focus seems to be on ecclesiastical or family stewardship. But I promise you, we will be held accountable for not only how we treat one another in our communities, but how we treat the land, how we treat our animals, how we treat the earth, how we treat the water, because they're all related. I believe the greatest gift we've been given is that of agency. We have agency to be self-reflective. We have agency to change ourselves, and it needs to start there. You know, Gandhi said that our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, although I wish we all could do that at times. But our greatest ability is to be able to change ourselves, and that's where it needs to start. But we have work to do. Environmental injustice and systemic racism still exists in our communities today, and in our schools and in our church. We need to acknowledge its existence. We need to get involved by speaking up. And I believe we need to hold our leaders accountable. I like to say that this is our Samuel the Lamanite moment. To get on a wall, if needed, and shout at the top of our lungs, enough, enough. Robin Wall Kimmer said that it's not enough to know the names of the plants. I've memorized all of them in my grandmother's plant diary, but I don't know their songs. My grandmother would have knew their songs. I want to share with you before we go tonight a song that was taught to me by a tribal elder, a Western Shoshone, and she taught me the Mother Earth song. And I want to read you the words before I sing the song in Shoshone. The Mother Earth song says, "Your children are here on Mother Earth. They are standing in a good way. They talk in a good way. Your children here on Mother Earth, they are standing in a good way. They are lying down. They are sitting down. Your children here on Mother Earth, they are singing in a good way. They are acting in a good way. Your children here on Mother Earth, they are dancing in a good way. Your children here on Mother Earth, and they are walking in a good way. Your children are coming this way, and they feel good. And they are laughing because they are at one with Mother Earth." Wee-hoo, 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 wee-hoo. Amanani asono wanakenda. Wee-hoo, wee-hoo, wee-hoo. Sana wana niha, sana wana kenda, sana wana kenda. yasamakatia. Yehu, Yehu, Yehu. I don't wanna dias, I don't wanna get us, I don't wanna dia, not she come the window. Yehu, Yehu, Yehu. Wanna dia, wanna dia, wanna get us, wanna get us, wanna dia. Yehu, Yehu. I am so grateful for the teachings of my people. They have ground me into the person I've become today. I know we're probably going to have a closing prayer, but I want to share with you, just as I conclude my remarks tonight, on a Shoshone prayer. It's a written prayer, so I'm going to read it, but it was a prayer that was shared to be by my grandmother, and we usually say it at the end of all of our meetings. But it goes something like this. It says, "O great spirit, whose voice we hear in the winds, and whose breath gives life to all the world, hear us. We come humbly before you as your children. We are small and weak. We need your strength and wisdom. Let us talk in beauty using medicine words, words of love and unity, words that uplift and inspire. Make our hands respect the things that you have made, and our ears to hear your voice in the wind. Make us wise so we may know the things that you have taught our people and the lessons that you have hidden in every leaf and rock. We always seek strength, not to be superior to my brothers, but to be able to fight our greatest enemy, ourselves. Make us ready to come to you with clean hands and straight eyes, so that when life fades, as the fading sunset, our spirits may come to you without shame." I am grateful for those teachings. I'm grateful for the fact that I'm a sixth generation Latter-day Saint. I get asked every day, with everything that's going on in the world, how I stay. I stay because I have a firm belief in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it's easy to stay. Man, not so much. I think men make mistakes, and so it's easy for me to navigate that because I have a firm foundation of a creator that wants only the best for his children, all his children, regardless of where we fall. So I'm grateful for the opportunity you've given me to share some of the Native American things that I've been taught my whole life. And I hope in some way it may have resonated with some of you. And so, again, I'm grateful, and I hope you all have a wonderful night. And if you have questions or how you want to go after this, I'd be more than happy to stick around and have a discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Darren. That was just so beautiful and inspiring. And I hope that that we can get a copy of that prayer to include with our information on this podcast. We will be taking some questions in the chat. And as people are coming up with those questions, I just wanted to ask you if there were any books or podcasts that you would recommend. You've already referenced Braiding Sweetgrass, which was a life-changing book for me. I don't know, but that one was just it really changed my perspective on so many things. And it sounds like you've also found her words very, very inspiring as well.
Yeah, in fact, I read that and it just reminded me so much of my grandmother and a lot of the things that she said, my grandmother said. And I thought, well, this must just be indigenous wisdom. There must be a pool of indigenous wisdom thoughts that every tribal elder just knows. And so, yeah, reading those stories and how the importance of our environment and how richly we're actually tied to the environment. And I was taught never to look at plants and animals any different than I looked at another human being. And so when you grow up with that worldview and you have that idea in your mind, it's easy to want to take care of the environment and have those value systems. So I'm kind of blanking on a podcast. I don't do a lot of podcasts because I don't have a lot of time. I'm probably speaking every day of the week, most of the time somewhere. So, but I love her book, and gosh, I know there are other things out there, and if I think about them, I'll put them in the chat.
All right, thank you.
Other than my book, of course.
Oh, your book. It looks like we don't have a lot of questions so far. So if anybody has a question at this point, if you would put that into the chat. We do want to let the audience know that you are speaking again tomorrow at the Environmental Humanities program at the U of U, talking about healing the Bear River. And so if anybody is interested in that, the registration has been linked in the chat. And I guess if there are any other thoughts that you have.
Yeah, the talk tomorrow is healing the Bear River, healing the Great Salt Lake. And I know, water is life to Native American people. And so it'll become a completely different discussion, really focused more around what we're doing at the Bear River Massacre Site. And that restoration plan will have a great impact on the Great Salt Lake and making sure the Great Salt Lake survives. Our creation story as a tribe, every tribe has a creation story, and our creation story has roots at Antelope Island of the Great Salt Lake. So that Great Salt Lake is vitally important to our people, and it will be going forward for all of us. So that's just part of what your group does anyway. So
do you have any recommendations, excuse me, for people who are listening who maybe would like some ideas on how best to get involved in some of these restoration projects, these preservation projects, as well as understanding some of these stories and histories that you have referenced?
Yeah, we actually, our restoration project, we purchased the Bear River Massacre Site in 2018. And from that day on, we've been doing a restoration project at the site. And we've worked very closely with Utah State University to do a lot of the work that's being done there. Professor Sarah Klain and Will Munger have been hugely instrumental in helping us give the science behind what we need to do. We're taking out invasive species and reintroducing plants that were there based on my plant diary from my grandmother's diary, reintroducing the plants that would have been there in 1863. Not only that, we're cleaning up the waterways. And so by doing that, we're actually healing the Bear River, because these waterways are running, they're tributaries to the Bear River, which is a tributary to the Great Salt Lake. So all of the restoration work that's being done there will be opportunities for people to get involved, probably in the spring, to plant some things with us. And the Utah Environmental Corps took out a lot of brush and olives this last fall. And so the restoration work is ongoing, and they can contact me, and I'd be more than happy to, or Utah State University, and we'd be more than happy to get them in touch with people that can help. but it's the College of Natural Resources at Utah State that have really been instrumental in helping us with that ecological work.
Okay. We do have a couple questions that have come in. First, several people would like to know the name of your book so that they can find it.
Oh, okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
The Bear River Massacre, a Shoshone History.
Okay,
And,
there's the book.
that was just sitting on my desk, but I didn't have that planned, but I'm glad it was there. So if you live in Logan, Hearns carries it, the book table carry it, and if you'd like a copy, you can get in touch with me and I'll sign a copy and mail it to you for $10. And that's what you can buy it on Amazon for. So
Nice offer. Some of the other questions, we have one question about what similarities do you find between Native American beliefs concerning the earth and the restored gospel? So where does that overlap for you?
well, there's a lot of similarities, but one thing I really love is teepee openings are always facing the east. So the door of a teepee will always be facing east, because we believe that the Great Spirit came to earth one day and said he would return again from the east. And so Native American teepee doors are always facing the east. And so many of our ceremonies, the Sundance and Ghost Dance and other ceremonies, point to a Great Spirit who created us all. Chief Washakie, a great Shoshone chief, he referred to the Great Spirit as the Father above the clouds. And we've just always had a belief that he gave us guidance once, came to the earth and talked to our people, gave us guidance, and rose in the clouds and said he'd come again one day. And we're waiting for that return. The Hopi Indian tribe, they're amazing to me, because I believe they sued the LDS Church years and years ago because they said that the LDS Church was using their ceremony in the temple from ceremonies they've had for thousands of years. And where would the Hopi have learned those things? All of our ceremonies and things that are still done, even though I'm LDS, I still participate in sweat lodges. I still participate in smudging ceremonies. And so I don't find that they don't conflict in my mind. So I think it's all the same to me. So I'm trying to put all my contact information in the chat box.
Oh, okay.
So,
well, as you're doing that, there are a couple of questions that are sort of touching on some similar themes, one of which is how can white people start incorporating practical ways to honor the earth, as well as honoring our brothers and sisters, and in some ways to maybe learn from indigenous cultures, but without appropriating any practices or culturally sensitive things.
Try to be best friends with a native. I mean, there's so many good books out there. And by good books, let me just preface that by saying I would try to find indigenous authors, that just, it's a more authentic voice. And I know in Utah, there's 8 tribes, and it's easy to get a hold of tribal offices and cultural resource specialists. But I think it's becoming easier every day to get a hold of some work that's actually done by Native Americans themselves. And I would just ask a lot of questions. And when you see maybe a ceremony going on somewhere, go and learn more about that culture, and learn as much as you can about it from the people that are living it and are doing it. And so I think that's the best way that we can do things without stepping on anybody's toes.
Yeah, just get familiar. I think that's wonderful advice. We have a question for whether you have an opinion or a position on the plan to restore Utah Lake with development.
Oh, people have been trying to drag me into that one for a long time now. But
Maybe maybe
I'm
more to the Native American connection to the lake historically. Is that?
yeah. Let me tell you, it's I'm against the development for sure, for positive, and but what I tell people is I defer that to the Utes and the Timpanogos Band, because the Utes lived in Utah County. The Utes, the Utah Lake was such an important part of their, it's the only way they lived and survived almost, because of the fish that was there. And so my Ute brothers and sisters, that's their fight and their thing. And I always tell people to call my good friend Forrest Kutch, the old director of Indian Affairs, because he's a Ute elder, but he knows much more about it than I do. But I certainly support the Utes in wanting to make sure that their voice is heard on especially this important topic. But I don't want to see any of that development take place. I'd love to see it cleaned up a little bit, but I'd love to see them consult the Ute tribe on what would be best practices going forward. And so I think until you get that indigenous wisdom and we start making those connections, I don't know how we succeed. If we just keep doing it the colonized way, we're going to keep getting the colonized results. And so maybe we ought to start looking at things a little differently. And some of those differences are some of the things that I kind of talked about tonight on how we view things. A lot of times it's just our shift in paradigm. It's not a me and we and I have rights and I'm going to do it. It's what can I do that will impact our community? My grandmother always told me that we are only as strong as the most vulnerable within our communities. And so if you have that view going forward, I think your community is going to be a much better place to live.
Yeah, I think that was one of the messages that struck me so strongly about braiding sweetgrass was going into that. And so I would again recommend that. And I don't know if I could offer, but one of the things that I looked for my daughter were some children's literature. And have you read The Birch Bark House? And that's
no, I haven't. I haven't.
Erdrich. That's a good place to start, I think, with children as well.
Yeah.
We have a question about whether you would expand a little more on being a 6th generation Latter-day Saint Shoshone.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I didn't talk about the Bear River Massacre at all tonight, but in 1863, we believe more than 400 of our men, women, and children were massacred just on the Utah-Idaho border by the U.S. Army. And but it was because of the Latter-day Saints that lived here in Cache Valley. They were the cause. They didn't fire a bullet, but they were absolutely the cause of the massacre. And so we had actually gotten along really well with the early pioneers that were here in the valley, but the depletion of resources led to that massacre. Over the next 10 years, the survivors did everything they could to just eke out a living. And at the end of the day, our chiefs began having dreams and other spiritual manifestations. And long story short, a missionary from Ogden baptized all of the survivors in one day on May 3rd in 1873. From that point on, we were members of the LDS Church. Because of that, we did not go to a reservation. We're one of the few tribes in the US today that did not get reservation land. Brigham Young said, "You're Mormons now." I know I can't say that word anymore, but especially after the lesson today. But the church established a church farm for us just north of Tremont in Utah. And they called missionary families that taught us to farm and ranch and plow the ground and plant crops. And so from 1878 to 1960, there was this flourishing Indian community north of there, and it was called Washakie. And so my dad was born and raised there. There was a schoolhouse, a social hall, church, and our people lived there. And so you know, from that point on, we were LDS. And so I'm a product of that. You know, the church allowed our people to do the sun dance and other ghost dance and other things. They didn't, and which is really forward thinking to me, because that really surprised me that they would allow them to practice those old ceremonies, knowing that, well, they probably didn't really understand them, but over time, and they didn't really tell them to quit, but over time, the people quit doing them. And it's because, you know, the second and third generations now are growing up as members of the church. They don't know anything else. And so, you know, the culture, they're beginning to lose that cultural identity. And that's what joining the church did more than anything else. We lose our language and we lose the cultural identity quicker than we would have before. The gain, I guess, though, is being members of the church. And so I grew up as a sixth generation Shoshone Latter-day Saint. I think I lived a very privileged life. I mean, as privileged as any of my friends. And so I didn't grow up the same as if I would have lived on a reservation. It's been a different thing for me. But still growing up at the feet of a grandmother who made sure that that cultural identity was hammered into me and made sure that I wouldn't forget it. And so I'm very grateful for that.
Well, that actually leads into our next question, which is what are ways that you think Indigenous youth can continue to keep these traditions? Like, are there efforts to revive the language study and some of those other efforts that some of the tribes have been doing?
Yeah, as a tribal leader, that's my biggest problem, is how do we retain the language? How do we retain the culture? And so we're working with the Eastern Band at Wind River to revitalize our language. We've received a grant to do so. And so that's a big thing to us. We only have 12 full speakers in a tribe of 600, and they're all over 80. So do the math. I mean, so that's a problem. And then the cultural identity, you know, our kids, you know, I had 7 kids, but my kids want an iPhone and they don't want to learn the culture and they don't want to do things. We wrote a grant. I worked with a professor at Utah State University named Brianne Litz. We talked about the biggest problem I have, and I said, it's the culture, getting the kids to want to learn the culture. And so over time, we came together to write a grant that was funded by the National Science Foundation to use technology, to introduce technology to our kids to learn the culture. And so now our kids, with the promise of an iPad and a video camera, if they sign up to do it, are out interviewing elders. And now they're being introduced to the culture with the hook of getting all this technology, which they want. But what it's really done is to really give them the chance to, oh my gosh, this is really cool stuff. And they'll go with an elder out on a plant walk, and the elders will teach them and show them how to make a doll out of a cattail. And now it's all of a sudden a cool thing, and they're all creating this content, video content and things that we're going to use at the interpretive center we're building at the massacre site. So we've reintroduced many of our youth today to their culture, and we've done it through technology, and it's been a beautiful thing to see, but it's still a challenge for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like it's overlapped with the need to document and preserve some of those things as well.
Yeah.
We have a question or a request to describe your view of a proper or beneficial relationship between the science that drives land or resource management and restoration with the traditional Indigenous traditions and practices. So bringing the Western and the Indigenous back together. Yeah,
and that's one thing, you know, I had all this Indigenous knowledge in my mind, but when we acquired that land, I went to, 700 acres and you go to the killing field, because all of those 400 bodies are still there. And you're seeing what decades of colonial land management has done with the grazing of cattle and the plowing and the fences and things. You're looking at it, and then you're seeing all these invasive species, including the Russian olive, which, you know, they planted, I guess, for erosion purposes, but they are the worst thing in the history of mankind. I don't know why anybody ever planted one, but they're very hard to get rid of. And so I didn't possess the skill set necessary to take care of the problem. And so it was really important to me to get the science involved early. And my first trip after we made that purchase was a trip to the Natural Resources Department, and I met with Chris Lukey and Mark Brunson in the College of Natural Resources. And I said, here's my idea. Tell me if we can do it. I want to restore the Bear River Massacre site to what it would have looked like in 1863. And so he said, well, let's go take a look. And one day we met, walked the ground, and they're taking notes. And, you know, I'm thinking, I know what I want, but I don't know how to get there. And so one of my favorite quotes that I give a lot when I speak is, the most successful Native Americans today are those who can best balance culture and change. And so using that as my guide, I realized my culture is absolutely the most vital thing in the world, but I've got to be able to embrace certain aspects of colonial worldview ideas that are actually probably best practices today in being able to get rid of some species and planting others. Using the climate adaptation people at Utah State, because of the climate change, is now going to allow me to know in advance whether a certain plant is going to be okay, or if it's not going to be okay, and if not, what can we do to make it okay. So there's so much science that I'm grateful for today that, you know, we have at my fingertips, so we wouldn't have had back then, and but we wouldn't have the climate change back then either. So we just make it both work, because we're using the best of both worlds, to me, I think, for the best possible outcome.
You know, my impression is that there has been greater awareness in the climate scientific community of a lot of these indigenous and traditional practices amongst many different people, African Americans and indigenous tribes, things like that. Do you see that as well? Do you see more incorporation of honoring and incorporating that traditional wisdom into the scientific questions and practices that are happening now?
Yeah, I do. And that's the only way it's going to happen. I just honestly feel that way. It can't happen the other way. It's got to happen this way. We need the problem to come to us and say, how can we use the indigenous wisdom to fine tune what we're doing and to make this thing better? And I think because they hold all the power anyway, it's going to happen or not happen on their watch. But as much as of indigenous wisdom as they can incorporate to the science, I think the better off we're all going to be.
Well, we are just about out of time. Do you have any final message that you would like us to take home?
No, other than I always say no and then I say something. So I just want people to know that it all begins with you. It all begins with us individually and doing. When I ran for Congress, you know, a year and a half ago, it all starts with the one person. And, you know, well, I can't change the global warming and I can't change the climate. You know, I have really, my footprint is not that great. Well, it might not be that great in your mind, but if every one of us looked at it that way and just did everything that we can ourselves and then get involved, I mean, say something and get involved when you can. And if you've got time and an effort to make it to a rally or something, but give people your voice. Donate some time and try to make this world a better place, even if it's to show support. And I think we'll be much better off in the future.
Thank you so much, Darren.
Oh,
I think we're going to have a follow-up conversation, because this is just giving me so many ideas, and it's so inspiring to hear the work that you've done and the messages that you are so effectively getting out to people. I mean, it sounds like you're quite the popular speaker. So,
wow. I'm just very grateful to have a voice
yes,
for our people.
and
So
you use it well. So thank you so much for taking the
thank
time.
you.